Was Mary, the mother of Jesus, truly a virgin? Was the virgin birth a literal fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14? Or was this the furthest thing from the mind of the prophet Isaiah? Dr. Seth Postell, Academic Dean of Israel College of the Bible, will be on today's episode to discuss the meaning of this crucial prophetic passage. Stay right there to learn more.
Welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
where we discuss all things Bible and theology.
Because it matters. What you really believe determines how you really behave.
Now, here is your host, Associate Professor of Bible Exposition at Dallas Theological Seminary
and Professor of Bible and Theology for the National Theological College and Graduate School,
Dr. Paul Weaver.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you are watching or listening to this podcast. I'm your host, Paul Weaver. I have the wonderful privilege each week of leading conversations with some of my favorite Bible scholars and Bible expositors. And this week is no exception. I'm pleased to have Dr. Seth Postell on this edition of the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. Dr. Postell is the Academic Dean of Israel College of the Bible in Israel, which is an educational ministry of One for Israel. Dr. Postell completed his PhD in the Hebrew Bible under the mentorship of Dr. John Sailhamer. He also studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and did postgraduate studies on literary approaches to the Hebrew Bible under leading Israeli scholars. He has authored or co-authored several books, including Adam as Israel, Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus, and essays that are in the Moody Handbook of Messianic Prophecy, as well as the Handbook of the Jewish Roots of the Christian Faith, and Reading the Psalms Theologically. Because of Dr. Postell's interest in inner biblical interpretation and the New Testament's use of the Tanakh, he is the perfect guest for today's program. Dr. Postell, welcome to the Bible and Theology Matters podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, before we jump into our conversation about this very important verse, would you give us an update on the situation in Israel as of today? We are recording at the end of the month of December 2024. How can I and my listeners pray for you, for the Jewish people, and other like-minded Christian ministries in Israel?
Yeah, so obviously since October 7th of last year, it's been a whirlwind of a lot of challenges. Israel's a kind of a tiny community, so there's not all of us either know somebody that was killed or know somebody that knows somebody that was killed. My son's lost his friends in battle. My cousin was actually on one of the kibbutzes that was raided by terrorists, and he miraculously escaped with his family. But he had friends and friends of his children that were kidnapped and murdered. And, it's impacted our school. One for Israel has our Bible college. And so we had students that are called up, and we've had, faculty that have been called up. And it's definitely impacted us on a very deep and personal level, all of us. That said, One for Israel, we're a ministry that we're a Great Commission ministry, and we have Arabs on faculty, we have Jews on faculty, we have Arab students, we have Jewish students. We believe in the gospel, we believe in the power of the gospel, and so throughout this whole time, we've been very much involved with evangelism, and we've seen, our YouTube channel, our Hebrew YouTube channel, which is specifically sharing the gospel with Israelis. Before the war, we had quite a large following. We were 80,000 subscribers, and that's huge. Now we're at close to 600,000 subscribers since the war, and obviously this is a Messianic YouTube channel. So a lot of people are seeking and searching. And so in that sense, we can say that the college is thriving, the ministry is thriving, evangelism is going well. It's been particularly painful to see the anti-Semitism that's sprung up in the world. We're grateful for many evangelicals that have really stepped up and are supporting and helping and humanitarian aid and praying. I do believe that one of the biggest blessings that could happen to Israel is a revival in the Middle East among Muslims. That I think that the key to really, provoking Israel to jealousy is the church would miraculously grow in Gaza, right? And in Syria and in Lebanon and in Iran. And, that's our prayer as well in Yemen, that, that people that have such a vicious hatred for the Jews will come and realize that, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven if your best friend isn't Jewish. Jesus is the Messiah and he's Jewish, and you've got to love a Jewish person with all your heart to be born again. And so that's what we're praying. But yeah, you can keep praying for us. Wisdom as we minister. It's crazy times right now with the fall of the Assad regime. It feels like the whole world's a roller coaster, but living in Israel, you're kind of in the front car. But God is good. God is on the throne, and we see God at work around us, and we're thankful for that. And again, thankful for the prayers of our brothers and sisters around the world and those that refuse to succumb to anti-Semitism, that are standing up and speaking out against Jew hatred.
Well, I do want to encourage people to go to the YouTube, look at One for Israel, check out Dr. Postell's personal testimony. It's very powerful. I'll put the link to that in the show notes. And you grew up in New Jersey, right? That's correct?
I did. The promised land.
About the size of Israel. It's the state of
exactly.
the United States that's about the size of Israel. But
exactly, I did.
Outside of Jerusalem. Well, in today's episode, as we celebrate Christmas this time of the year, I thought it would be appropriate to discuss Isaiah 7:14. Very familiar to our listeners and viewers, but what might be surprising to them is that this verse is controversial. In Isaiah 7:14, the New American Standard Bible reads, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel." So not only does the New American Standard Bible read virgin, but so does the New International Version, the English Standard Version, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, the Christian Standard Bible, the King James Version, the New King James Version, the New Living Translation, the Young Living Translation. So a lot of the modern translations translate that virgin. But the New Revised Standard Version translates the Hebrew word Alma, young woman, rather than virgin. And the modern non-Christian rabbinic translations also translate this word Alma as young woman. Dr. Postell, would you please explain what the interpretive issue is centered around this word Alma? In other words, how should we understand the lexical options for this word, and are the vast majority of our modern translations wrong in translating it virgin?
Obviously, there is a big issue here, and let me just simply say that if this verse is virgin, no matter what the historical context of this verse is, there's no double fulfillment. In other words, if the Hebrew word is virgin, then it's about the Messiah, and it can't be about anybody else. But there is a firestorm around the word, because the word that Isaiah uses is the word Alma. There are two words in Hebrew that the common word for virgin is Betula. Okay, and Isaiah doesn't use that word Betula. And so because Isaiah didn't use the word Betula, the assumption is that Alma, had he meant, and this is one of the arguments against Matthew's interpretation as well, that had this verse in the intent been that it was a virgin birth, then Isaiah would have used the word Betula, but he didn't. He used the word Alma. And so then the argument is that Alma, the only thing that Alma means is a young woman. And a young woman being pregnant, it's interesting because even, the verse doesn't actually say a woman will become pregnant or a virgin will become pregnant, because a virgin becoming pregnant is not a miracle because she's, once she sleeps with a man, she's no longer a virgin, she has a baby, or a young woman being pregnant. That's not a miracle, right? But the verse, the question is what is this? Is if it's an Alma as a young woman who is pregnant, then that's normal. So then the sign must be a different kind of a sign, right? So the issue here is whether this, is really a virgin or not. Is Alma only a young woman? Or is Alma something beyond? And why doesn't Isaiah, if he's talking about the virgin birth, why doesn't Isaiah use the word Betula? And so that's the issue.
So that's the argument that Rabbinic Judaism would make today, that Betula is the word that would have been used if this was a virgin than Alma.
Correct.
And any thoughts as to why the New Revised Standard Version chooses to translate it that way as well?
Alma, again, I think that why did they choose that route? I think that it's been my experience that even within evangelical camps, that tends to be a fairly normative position today, that it's not a virgin birth, that this is just a young woman, that the historical context suggests that this is not about the Messiah, but that there's a double fulfillment, that eventually the Septuagint translators translated as Parthenos, which by the time in first century Matthew, Parthenos meant virgin. And so Matthew looks at, the Parthenos being a virgin and looks at this verse and says, oh, it's a virgin birth, and that Jesus fulfilled it. And so there's kind of this sense that this passage in its historical context is not about the Messiah. It's not about the virgin birth, but it had kind of a historical, theological, exegetical development so that by the time that Matthew takes hold of it, there was, the view that this is about the Messiah and it does point to the virgin birth. So you got to kind of explain it as kind of like a double fulfillment. One fulfillment in the days of Ahaz. So the question then, is this Isaiah's wife that's pregnant, or is it Ahaz's wife that's pregnant? And then eventually it's fulfilled again in a greater way in Mary. Now, I don't agree with what I just said, but that's the view.
And so that's probably troubling to some who are introduced to this for the first time. But this are the conversations being had, and many hold that position in that. And we'll talk about the fulfillment in Matthew, that it somehow changes the meaning, or like you said, double fulfillment of some sort. But we need to stick to the text of Isaiah first before we see how Matthew's applying it, don't we?
Correct, absolutely. And I mean, the way that I live in a world in which, I'm Jewish, and when I talk to Jewish people that don't believe in Jesus, the argument that says that Isaiah 7 is about the Messiah and the virgin birth because Matthew, who's an inspired apostle, says it's true, does not hold weight. It's circular reasoning. There's nothing, in what sense did Jesus fulfill Isaiah chapter 7? Are you saying that in order for me to believe it's a messianic prophecy, I've got to believe it's a messianic prophecy because Matthew tells me it's a messianic prophecy, but I don't accept Matthew, and therefore that's circular reasoning. And so I just simply can't allow, I think it's, if I go that route, to me, it's like, I don't know the expression in English, giving up the farm, or, I'm selling out. It's like the moment I admit to double fulfillment, I'm basically admitting that Isaiah 7 is not about the Messiah and that Matthew was wrong.
In just a moment, we're going to continue the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. But first, our missions moment of the week. Today's testimonial is from a pastor in the Middle East who is a student at the National Theological College and Graduate School. For his protection and that of his congregation, we have edited out names and places. But he's working among a very special people group in the Middle East called the Druze. Please join me as we listen in.
I'm the pastor of All the members are from Sunni's background. Father was Lebanese, my mother was Egyptian, a Sunni. The character of Jesus has captured my heart. I turned to be a Christian believer, and I started my first Bible study when I was 19 years old. I started bit by bit declaring my faith and sharing it with people around me. Persecution happened to my life several times. I faced many difficulties, but the Lord was there all with me and helped me to plant the first ever church in the area. We don't have any other churches, and now the church is 9 years old. We are happy that the Lord is bringing lots of people to Him. I enrolled to be a student in anti-CGS to help myself to get equipped and sharpened for the ministry. I'm thankful that the Lord have gave me this opportunity, really ready for the name of the Lord to be glorified in all the Middle East.
The National Theological College and Graduate School is a strategically placed school with 3 campuses in the Middle East and 1 in East Africa. To learn more about how you can partner with NTCGS in equipping future leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ like this pastor in Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and East Africa, please visit ntcgs.org. That's ntcgs.org. Well, how should we understand the difference between these 2 Hebrew words, Betula and Alma?
Yeah. So I got to say, a book that, I want to recommend a book. It's not an easy book to understand. It's very much into linguistics and phonology and things like that. It's a phenomenal book by Christoph Rico and Peter Gentry. And I think that they wrote one of the most important works on the whole meaning of Alma. And I found that their work was that was very helpful to me. So what I'm basically saying at this point are things that I learned from them. Now, when we talk about the context and how do we deal with the historical context, I'll share a little bit more about, my own personal research. But in terms of Alma and Betula, and so again, I need to give credit to whom credit is due. And so Betula is in fact the word virgin. There are some that try to argue on the basis of its usage in Joel that it doesn't always mean virgin, but I would disagree. Of the 50 times in the Hebrew Bible, it's a virgin. It's absolutely a virgin. Okay. So then the question is, if Betula is virgin, why Alma? Okay. And so what's really important, okay, is that Betula has no reference to age. So you can be a Betula that's 90 years old, or you can be a Betula that's 15 years old, okay? There's no reference to age. Betula is a virgin all the time. But when we come to the word Alma, and this is really important, why does Isaiah use the word Alma? What does that even mean in Isaiah 7:14? Well, the word is only used 9 times. It's only used 9 times. And even though in modern Hebrew today, Alma means young woman, okay, we have to look and argue and wrestle through its meaning within the biblical text. And there are several cases that the meaning is completely unclear. It's used as a title, like in Psalm 46. It's used as a title for a role in the temple. Okay, it's used. So there are at least 1, 2, 3, 4 cases in which the word appears, but it doesn't say anything about what it means. Okay, there are also cases. There are 2 cases that are debatable. One is Isaiah 7:14, and the other is Proverbs 30, verse 19. Okay, these are 2 cases where there's an argument. Does it mean virgin or does it not mean virgin? And some would use Proverbs 30:19, okay, to prove that it means that it's not a virgin. But when you look at the poetry and you look at the parallelism in the poetry, you suddenly realize that actually it's not a clear-cut issue. And therefore, you cannot use Isaiah 7:14 or Proverbs 30:19 to make a case one way or another. You cannot use an unclear example to prove what it actually means, okay? But in every case where Alma can be determined, in every case where it's clear, it's a young girl of marriageable age who's a virgin. So in Genesis 24, verse 43, virgin. Exodus 2, verse 8, a virgin. Song of Songs 6:8, a virgin. Okay? So in every case where you can actually make the context is clear, it is a very young woman of marriageable age that is a virgin. Okay? Now, if you're wanting to understand the meaning of the word Alma in Isaiah, you ought to stick first and foremost with Isaiah. And I think that their discussion on Isaiah 54 was to me very eye-opening in terms of realizing that Alma in the book of Isaiah has to be virgin. And that's what's remarkable, absolutely remarkable about Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Okay? Why? Because in Isaiah chapter 7:14 in Hebrew does not say, New American Standard says this, therefore the Lord will give you a sign, behold, a virgin will be with child. That's not what the Hebrew says. It does not say will be with child. The Hebrew actually says, okay, therefore the Lord will give you a sign, behold, a virgin or an Alma is pregnant. An Alma is pregnant. For an Alma to be pregnant is truly a miracle, because an Alma, in every case where you can see and determine its meaning, it's a woman of marriageable age who's still a virgin because she's not married. Isaiah 54 in the poetry and in the context defines an Alma as a woman who is unmarried without a child, and the only way to solve her childlessness is for her to get married, to have a child. And therefore, we have a pregnant virgin. That is the best translation of this verse. And it's a miracle.
So we've established that Alma is a young woman who is a virgin, and not simply a young woman as some have tried to argue. Now, Matthew quotes from this passage. In the Gospel of Matthew, we learn that when Joseph observed that Mary was with child, and he knew Joseph, was not the father, he naturally assumed that Mary had been unfaithful to him. And so this is during the betrothal period. And in Matthew 1:23 we read, but when he, speaking of Joseph, had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child who has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. Virgin birth, right? She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now all this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. That's a reference back to Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the virgin shall be with child, and shall bear a son. And they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. So today there are Old Testament Christian scholars, as well as Jewish rabbis, who say Isaiah 7:14 was fulfilled during the time of Isaiah, and therefore Jesus is not the direct fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14. Please explain why you and I both believe that Isaiah 7:14 was not fulfilled during the lifetime of Isaiah, and why Matthew was correct to say that Jesus was the direct fulfillment of this prophecy.
Yeah. So let's just start and say, if we've established the fact that the word Alma is a young woman of marriageable age that can't have a child because she doesn't have a husband, she hasn't slept with a man, then the moment you say that this is a virgin, it basically eliminates all possibility of double fulfillment. I mean, it's over. In other words, you've to a certain extent, you've kind of won the battle, and now you just have to clean up. And so what's the cleanup here? The cleanup here is that one of the arguments against the Messianic interpretation is that, hey, this was supposed to be fulfilled in the time of Ahaz. You know, if you look at the historical context, it's happening in the days of Ahaz, and then, you know, in the time of Assyria. And if you're just looking at the historical context, it cannot be a promise or a sign to Ahaz that, you know, is going to be fulfilled 700 years later and make any sense. And so what I would argue is that that's being a little bit careless It's being a little bit careless with the immediate context. And let me explain to you what I mean. Okay. So if we look at Isaiah chapter 2 and Isaiah chapter 11 and 12, those are the framing passages that form the context, or it's the frame, it's the literary framework of the story of Isaiah and his encounter with Ahaz in the south, okay, King Ahaz. What's really interesting is that if you look at Isaiah chapter 2, it's defining this vision for the last days, and all the nations are coming up to worship the Lord. Jerusalem is on high. It's the last days. And in fact, it's really interesting in Isaiah chapter 2. Let me just read parts of it, okay? The mountain of the Lord will be established, okay? Many peoples will come and say, let us go up. The law will go forth from Zion. Okay, verse 4, and he will judge between many nations and will render decisions for many people. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Okay, so what's really interesting is if you look at Isaiah chapter 11, you have repeated language, because there in Isaiah 11, you have this whole judging with equity, which is in chapter 2. And so, you've got this shoot from, that will spring from the stem of Jesse, from the house of David. It's the Messiah, okay? He will delight in the fear of the Lord. Verse 4 of chapter 11, with righteousness he will judge the poor and decide with fairness the afflicted of the earth. It is really clear that Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 11 are connected. And then Isaiah 11 and Isaiah 12 is kind of talking about new creation, a new Eden language in the first part of the vision of the Messiah. The second part, it kind of talks about this new exodus of regathering like the first exodus. And so you've got this new Moses theme. Okay, so that sets the context for Isaiah 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so here we go. What's really interesting is that no rabbis that I know of, no Jewish interpreters, look at Isaiah 11 and say Isaiah 11 is about Hezekiah, okay? Which is odd, and I'll tell you why it's odd. Because if you look at chapter 10, and you look at this, it's an oracle against the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria is bragging and boasting about how all the other gods have fallen. And so obviously the God of Israel is going to fall, okay? And if you look at the words of the king in Isaiah chapter 10, okay, it is quoted almost verbatim in the words of when Sennacherib sends Rabshakeh up to Jerusalem against Hezekiah. He's quoting Isaiah chapter 10, and it looks as though Isaiah chapter 10 is actually referring to things that took place in the days of Hezekiah. And then what ends up happening, okay, is that at the end of Isaiah chapter 10, the king of Assyria is lopped off. He's chopped off. But what's really interesting, look at chapter 8, the same. You've got the Assyrian threat, and then in chapter 9, a son is given. And in chapter 9, the son is given. In verse 3, all the boots are being burned, and there's this incredible victory. That looks just like the victory of Hezekiah when the angel of the Lord struck down all the soldiers of Hezekiah, of Assyria. Okay? And yet this child in Isaiah chapter 9 can't be Hezekiah. Why? Because he's sitting on the throne of David forever. Chapter 10, you think, okay, lopping off of Assyria. Chapter 11, the shoot springs up. You think, okay, that's got to be Hezekiah. But it can't be Hezekiah. Why can't it be Hezekiah? Because the shoes are too big. It's like a little child wearing his dad's shoes. The shoes are too big because you're talking about this incredible kingdom that's going to be birthed and again, new creation. So if I'm going to argue that Isaiah chapter 7 can't be about the Messiah because it's placed in the context of the days of Assyria, well, then that means I've got to throw Isaiah 9 out the window, and I've got to throw Isaiah 11 out the window. But I can't. And therefore, what I would argue is that if you look at the literary context that's framed by the vision of the last days, this child in chapter 7 has to be the Messiah. He is God with us, who in chapter 10 is identified as God himself. In Isaiah chapter 8, that is, God with us, Emmanuel, is God himself. What's really interesting, again, if you look at the vision, by the way, Micah chapter 5, if you look at the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem, it sets it in the time of the kings of Assyria. You have to understand Isaiah 7 in the context in which the inspired author put it. The inspired author, Isaiah, put Isaiah 7 in the context of the birth of a child, Isaiah 9, the birth of a child, chapter 11, and therefore it has to be messianic. I would argue the moment you prove that virgin is the right translation of the word, you've won the argument. It has to be the Messiah, no double fulfillment. And then the moment you say that Isaiah chapter 11 has to be messianic, then you've proven that Isaiah 7 has to be messianic too, because Isaiah 11, it's almost like the child looks like Hezekiah in chapter 7. He looks like Hezekiah in chapter 9. He looks like Hezekiah in chapter 11. But I would argue that the deeds of Hezekiah in the book are a sign for the Messiah, because later on in the book you see that even though Hezekiah kind of looks like he might be the Messiah, he fails. And so we're waiting for a future son from the house of David.
So how would you respond to the person that says, well, then this had no real significance as a sign to Ahaz?
Yes, but the sign was to the house of David. And that's the point. It actually says it's a sign to the house of David. And what's really interesting is that Ahaz actually rejects the sign. He doesn't even accept the sign. And so in that sense, even if God gave him a sign, he wouldn't believe it anyway. The sign is not for him. The sign is for the house of David.
So now there are godly Christian scholars that try to make the case, as we've discussed already a little bit, that Isaiah 7:14 was fulfilled during the time of Isaiah by Ahaz's son, and also fulfilled in Luke chapters 1 and 2 with Mary. So in the near referent would be just a woman of marriageable age, but not a virgin, and the far referent would be the virgin birth. How would you respond? You've articulated a little bit of this, but how would you bring this together and respond?
The only way you can make that argument is that Alma doesn't mean virgin. That's the only way you can make the argument. You can't say there's a double fulfillment if Alma actually means a virgin, right? At that point, how many children were born of a virgin in history? And what's really interesting is that if there were two virgin births, what's really crazy is there's nothing more mentioned about the child in the book of Isaiah. Like, that's a big deal. The double fulfillment basically depends on Alma not meaning virgin. If Alma is virgin, there's no double fulfillment. Number two, I would say that the literary context just simply, again, would we say that there's a double fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 9? Because, again, Isaiah 9 seems to place the child's birth in the days of Assyria. And so would we say, therefore, then there's got to be two wonderful counselors, two mighty gods, and then what about then Isaiah chapter 11? Because it seems to put it in the days of Sennacherib. And so should we say that there are two roots of Jesse? The shoes for this child are way too big for Hezekiah. And the context identifies it as the last days. And therefore, again, I think that double fulfillment just simply doesn't take seriously, in my opinion, what the word Alma actually means. And number two, it doesn't take seriously the literary context. Again, I think it's an attempt to try to tie Isaiah 7 into a historical context, but it ignores the ways in which the author has set Isaiah 7 within a literary context that's looking forward to the last days.
So we've been addressing really often the evangelical arguments against, the Isaiah 7:14 being the virgin birth, or at least a double fulfillment of some sort. Would you say, now I'm going off script a little here, but from an anti-missionary perspective, I know you use that term often, would the motivation be to show that this isn't Jesus?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So basically to say, if you're an evangelical, I'm not trying to be mean or anything, I'm just simply saying, if you're an evangelical that is arguing for a double fulfillment, from an anti-missionary perspective, you've lost the argument, because what you're admitting is that Isaiah 7 is not a messianic prophecy. It really isn't a messianic prophecy, and that you're relying on apostolic authority. In other words, Isaiah 7 is only messianic because Matthew says it's messianic, and hey, you believe that Matthew is an apostle and he's inspired and he can say whatever he wants to about the Old Testament because he's got insights into divine intentions beyond the intentions of historical author. But for an anti-missionary, that would be his circular reasoning, saying that's nonsense. That's absolutely nonsense. If you're going to argue for what's called sensus plenior, you're basically admitting that Isaiah 7 is not a messianic prophecy. Because what is a prophecy? A prophecy is something that looks forward to future fulfillment. A prophecy is not looking back in history and giving new meaning retrospectively, right? And so again, that's why I think that this discussion is so critical. For me, I less care, it sounds bad, but I less care what, maybe some evangelical scholars are saying about this passage. That's less. I do care, what my people are saying about this passage, because I do believe that this is a very important passage for identifying Yeshua, Jesus, as the promised Messiah. And I think that we have to defend Matthew's exegesis not by appeal to sensus plenior or a fuller meaning, but by actually getting our hands dirty and exegeting Isaiah chapter 7.
Well, as we wrap up this episode, what are some takeaways that you would like to leave my listeners and viewers with as it relates to prophecy in general and say, Isaiah 7:14 in particular?
Yeah. Well, obviously, this is a season where we're celebrating. It's a miraculous birth, and I would say, when I growing up in a Jewish family, I would hear Christmas songs, an unbelieving Jewish family, born as the King of Israel. It didn't make sense to me. It's like, wait a minute, Jesus isn't, King of Israel. It just, I find it ironic that the entire world is celebrating the birth of this Jewish baby at a time when so much of the world hates the Jewish people. And it's sad. I could say even stomach turning. And so I think if I could just say, please pray that we'll celebrate the birth of this baby too. Pray that we'll see that Yeshua really is our Messiah. He's the King of Israel, right? And he is Emmanuel. And pray for our people that we will see and love our Savior. And I would also encourage Christians to realize that the New Testament doesn't just impose meanings back on the Old Testament. I really do believe that the more I've studied the Hebrew Bible, the more convinced I am that the New Testament authors were incredibly gifted and sensitive readers of the Hebrew Bible. In other words, we don't need the New Testament to defend the Old Testament faith. We can use the Old Testament to defend the New Testament faith.
Very good. Agree entirely. Thank you so much, Dr. Postell, for joining us for this episode. We'd love to have you back on to hear about how God's working in a great way amongst the Jewish people in Israel and around the world. And thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you very, very much.
Well, our time is up for this edition of the Bible and Theology Matters podcast. I do hope that you'll return again next week for another great episode. And if you enjoyed today's Bible and Theology Matters podcast, you may also enjoy our 6 to 10 minute faith-affirming findings video series. In these videos, I describe and illustrate some of the most important discoveries from the field of biblical archaeology. These discoveries will affirm your faith in the historicity and reliability of Scripture and provide unique insights into the background of the Bible. You can find them on our YouTube channel, which is also called Bible and Theology Matters. Simply go to YouTube and in the search engine type Bible and Theology Matters, or go to our website and click on the YouTube link. And keep your eye out for my book by the same name, Faith Affirming Findings, which is to be released in the upcoming year. Well, Until next time, never forget, Bible and theology matters, because what you really believe determines how you really behave.
Bible and Theology Matters podcast is a listener-supported podcast
devoted to helping Christians grow in their knowledge of the Word of God and in their relationship to the God of the Word.
To learn how you can partner with the Bible and Theology Matters podcast,
visit us at BibleandTheologyMatters.com. That's Bible, A-N-D, TheologyMatters.com.